Jacques Pauwels es un historiador nacido en Gante, Bélgica, que lleva muchos años afincado en Canadá, donde ha enseñado en las universidades de Toronto, York y Waterloo. Pauwels es una referencia indispensable para conocer la historia del siglo XX en Occidente y desmontar los mitos construidos por los relatos oficiales o lo que él llama la historia confortable, especialmente sobre las dos guerras mundiales en Europa, la Guerra Fría y la etapa postsoviética. Aparte de los múltiples artículos que ha escrito y publicado, Jacques Pauwels es autor de varios libros traducidos a varios idiomas, entre los que destacaremos 4. La Gran Guerra de Clases, 1914-1918. El mito de la Guerra Buena, Estados Unidos en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. El Gran Capital con Hitler y los mitos de la historia moderna, desde la Revolución Francesa a las grandes guerras mundiales del siglo XX y la Guerra Fría. El análisis histórico de Jacques Pauwels es un análisis materialista cuyo eje es la dialéctica guerra-revolución, en la que se debate la democracia. Pero por democracia no entiende la vigente actualmente en los países capitalistas, que él llama pseudodemocracia, sino la democracia radical, la que emerge del demos, esto es, de la amplia base social. Pues bien, el propio Jacques Pauwels ha tenido la amabilidad de aceptar esta entrevista con Canarias-semanal. Jacques Pauwels, estamos muy honrados de que haya aceptado ser nuestro invitado hoy.
It's a pleasure being here.
En su libro sobre la Primera Guerra Mundial, usted sostiene que una poderosa razón del estallido de esta guerra fue la de evitar las revoluciones sociales, siendo otro motivo importante el impulso imperialista de conquista de nuevos territorios. Mi pregunta es, ¿fue la Segunda Guerra Mundial una aventura antirrevolucionaria e imperialista también? En otras palabras, ¿cuáles son las similitudes y diferencias entre las dos guerras?
Well, the answer is yes, but of course, a short answer like yes isn't enough. I have to explain why the answer is yes. I have written a book on the First World War, the Great Class War, 1914, 1918, and I've also written a book on the Second World War. And the two world wars obviously belong together. They are indeed two parts of one big war, which is sometimes called the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, but which is also sometimes called Europe's Great Civil War, because while it was a world war, it was, of course, focused very much on Europe. I mean, less so in the Second World War, but you know what I mean. The big powers that were involved were still mostly Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and so on, with the United States and Japan, major players, especially in the Second World War, far less so in the First World War, but still on the periphery to become the center, so to speak, certainly the United States, only after the Second World War. So if you look at Europe at the First and Second World War together as a sort of a great European civil war, then that is how you can also understand why I call the First World War a class war, and why in many ways the Second World War is also a class war. A class war in the sense that the First World War was not a war for democracy, it was a war against democracy, because the elites that were still in power everywhere in Europe in 1914, because there was no democracy or very little democracy in 1914, these elites did not like democracy, they hated democracy. They fought back tooth and nail against democracy. They despised democracy. The idea that the royal heads, the kings, and all these elites, the bourgeois elites, that they love democracy is nonsensical. And it's easy to understand because these elites are a minority. And democracy means the vote for everybody. And that means that the majority will not vote for the candidates, for the people that represent the interests of the elite. So democracy cannot possibly be in the interests of a small demographic minority, which is what the people in power were in 1914 and still in 1939. The little bit of democracy that was there, and there was a little bit of democracy there already in 1914, and a bit more democracy that popped up later on, I can explain why, and it was not full-fledged democracy. Unfortunately, today, we talk a lot about our democracy here in Canada, our democracy, the American democracy. Well, there's no such thing as democracy. Democracy is still a utopia in the future. It's something that we are striving towards. And it's true that we have more democracy now than in the past, but we don't have full-fledged democracy. We have what I call, in my book, pseudo-democracy. It looks a bit like democracy. It makes you think it's democracy, but it really isn't democracy. But the people in power want you to believe it's democracy. So back to my war now. So the First and Second World War were wars against democracy and against the kind of historical phenomenon that tends to bring about more democracy, not full-fledged, perfect democracy, but a step forward to democracy. And that's revolution. Because historically speaking, in modern times, since the French Revolution, democracy has been advanced. The cause of democracy has been advanced. We've made progress towards democracy. The democratization process has been advanced through revolution. And historically, and I'll explain in a minute why, and historically also, one can argue that the way in which democracy has been, the process towards democracy has been arrested, rolled back, or that democracy has been prevented is through war. So there is indeed this dialectic between war and revolution. Revolutions tend to push forward the cause of democracy, and wars tend to claw back the movement towards democracy. And that's not so difficult to understand if you know that, for example, when there's a war, immediately the democratic niceties are suspended. Like the parliaments are closed, the generals take over. Now you must obey. There's no time for discussions in parliament. Immediately when there's a war on, not any kind of war, the niceties of democracy are suspended. And we saw that even in the United States with the war against terror. Immediately there was the Patriot Act that was promulgated in the United States, where people who are not with us are considered to be against us, where criticism of the government can be punished very heavily. So warfare, even threatened warfare, even Cold War is bad for democracy. And whereas revolution tends to be good for democracy. And I'll explain that with a few simple examples, because a lot of people think revolution is bad, it's bloodshed and so on. And it is bloodshed very often too, but for different reasons. But the revolution has made major advances. It's because of the French Revolution, for example, that for the first time, a country in Europe abolished slavery. Now, slavery was a very undemocratic institution, extremely undemocratic, And the idea that a country actually abolished slavery, that's a wonderful step forward for democracy. And that was done for the first time, not in the United States. They didn't even dream of it. They wanted slavery, but slavery was only abolished in the United States in 1863, but in France in 1794, during the French Revolution, during the most radical phase of the French Revolution. And actually, it was Napoleon who brought slavery back. And slavery was abolished definitively during the Revolution of 1848. And you can make similar points that a lot of good things in terms of democratic progress were brought about by revolutions. And when wars came, there was the end of the progress towards democracy. So now back to our wars of the 20th century. The First World War was very much a war against democracy as opposed to a war for democracy. And it was a war that was also proposed to forestall new revolutions, which were in the air. Revolutions are harbingers, as vehicles for democracy. And that is what the First World War was all about on the one hand. But there's also on the other hand, because wars are not simple black and white affairs. Wars are complex historical phenomena, where there is no simple good guys versus bad guys, which is the way that the war, for example, today is represented in Ukraine. Putin is the bad guy and we're the good guys, and no more discussion. It's not like that at all. It's much more complicated than that. So wars are by definition pretty complex, pretty complicated historical phenomena. And world wars are by definition very complex. So the First World War was a war on the one hand, a class war, definitely a class war, a war whereby the upper classes hoped to use the tool, the instrument of war to stop the progress towards democracy and prevent revolution, which might brought about too much democracy all of a sudden. Because before the First World War, revolution was very much in the air. There had already been a revolution in Russia in 1905, for example. And there was a revolution in China in 1912. So people were afraid of the revolution. The bourgeoisie was very afraid of the revolution. And they were hoping that a war, a good old-fashioned war, would stop the nonsense of the revolution. I mean, it's pretty well known that war abroad can often serve to diffuse war at home. That to solve domestic problems, a foreign war can be very, very useful. You know what I mean? If a country has experiences all kinds of social problems, then sometimes they we have an enemy outside that can stop the problems at home. So the First World War then was a war against democracy, a war to forestall revolution. And it's one of the ironies of history that instead of doing that, it actually brought about the Great Revolution. That's a different story. But it was also an imperialist war. It was also a war for territories where there were important raw materials to be had, such as petroleum, such as rubber, such as copper, later on uranium, you name it. And the possession of these territories was very, very important. So the First World War, in a way to try to deconstruct the complexity of it, was on the one hand a social war, a war against democracy and a war against revolution. But on the other hand, it was also an economic war. It was also an imperialist war. It was a war whereby the big players of the imperialist circle of powers, were competing with each other, you might say, for supremacy, for access to the territory, for control of territories where there were wonderful, important, strategically important raw materials. Like in those days, in the First World War, petroleum was becoming very important, and rubber, because the automobile had been invented, and boats were now using petroleum to sail around the world. So petroleum was becoming very, very important, right? So this was a big issue. Also, where these colonies could be used as markets for the finished products of an imperialist power's own industry. And we should not forget also that control of foreign countries, direct control, colonial control, or for that matter, indirect control, neo-colonial kind of an approach used by the United States mostly, that was also served to gain access to cheap labor. And that's something we should not understand. For example, the wealth of big companies like Michelin in France and Dunlop in England was basically built on the hard labor and the rubber of countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, where the French colonial system used a system of slavery, basically, to get its hands on the rubber. And the hard work of producing that rubber had to be done by the Vietnamese, which of course is why the Vietnamese wanted to get rid of the French colonial system after the Second World War, very understandably so. So we should not underestimate the importance of cheap labor. I live in Canada, and Canada was a British colony for a long time. And in Canada, the railway was built, and we're all supposed to be very proud of that. That was the transcontinental railway that was built. But what we tend to forget is it was built by a kind of slave labor. It was no longer called slavery because slavery by then had been abolished, but it was called coolie labor, where the British imported laborers from China and from India to work for very little money and do very dirty, very dangerous work. And many of them were killed in the process. So that was very important also for imperialism then, extending its control beyond its own boundaries, for the capitalism of the big industrial countries to become prosperous, to become successful, it had to become international. So capitalism had to become imperialism. And that's really what happened. And that's something that our history books tend to overlook. Imperialism is a dirty word that we don't prefer not to use, except when it's somebody else. We now say, well, Russian imperialism or Chinese imperialism, but we were never imperialist. That is nonsense. I mean, countries like Britain and France and the United States were very, very imperialist. And in the First World War, then imperialism was definitely a driving force, very, very important. So these are the two faces of the coin of the First World War, right? Now, the First World War, the result was not quite what was expected, because the idea was that there would be the war would lead to less democracy and no more revolution at all, no more talk of revolution. Unfortunately, from that perspective, the opposite happened. The war actually made people so unhappy, the war was so awful that it came to revolution, not only in Russia, but also in Germany and also in other countries. Revolutionary situations. There were revolutionary situations, even in Britain and France and Belgium at the end of the First World War. And there, to solve the problem, to prevent revolution, the governments had to bring in democratic reform. So they had to bring in more democracy as opposed to having less democracy, which they hated, but they had to. And worse than that, the war produced a successful revolution in the Soviet Union, in Russia, to become the Soviet Union, right? So what happened is that the revolution against which the First World War was directed in 1914, was actually the idea of revolution, the possibility of revolution, the abstract concept of revolution, which basically obsessed the bourgeoisie and many of the aristocracies that were still in power, right? But instead, they ended up with a real thing. They ended up with a concrete revolution, an ongoing revolution, a revolution embodied, personified, you might say, by a country, revolutionary Russia, to become the Soviet Union. Right? So, with respect to the Second World War, we'll still have a situation where we'll still have a class war against democracy and against revolution. And we'll still have an imperialist war. But if you want to talk about the class war aspect of it, this time, the Second World War will not be a war against the idea of revolution, but against the country that basically embodies revolution, and that's the Soviet Union. And that's how we can understand that in the 1930s, when Hitler, who was the most fanatic anti-Soviet, anti-counter-revolutionary politician in Europe, when he proclaimed in his book Mein Kampf that he wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, that's when in London, in Paris, in Washington, in Brussels, the politicians said, that's great. We have to support that guy. And that explains the policy of appeasement, as it's called, when the politicians in London and in Paris made concessions to Hitler, But they couldn't say that to the public. They had to pretend that it was to keep the peace. But they didn't really want peace. They wanted Hitler to wage war against the Soviet Union on the other side of Europe. And that also had the advantage, as they saw it, that if the German military machine would march east, they would not march west. So in France and Britain and Belgium, they say, this is great. We send Hitler's troops, Hitler's army, the German army, to the east to snuff out, to destroy the Soviet Union. Great. At the same time, he won't bother us. Right? That way he's going there. So that was one way in which the Second World War was also a war against democracy, a war against revolution. But the Second World War was also at the same time, like the First World War, a war of imperialisms. And let me be more specific now. Imperialism is the desire to lay your hands on territories where there are important resources, where there's cheap labor, where you can sell your products, where you can invest your surplus capital, profitably, all of that, right? That is very, very important. And but it's also sort of an idea for supremacy, because the idea is that the rivalry among the great powers, certainly until the First World War, was based on the assumption that rivalry it's tough, competition and all that. It's a tough business, and either you win or you lose. Right? Either you win and you become number one, or you fall by the wayside. So the struggle, this imperialist side of the First and Second World War, was not only a struggle for control of territories, that it certainly was for everybody, but it was also a struggle for primacy within the select club of imperialist powers, right? Who's going to be number one, right? And in the First World War, before the First World War, that was kind of undecided. Britain had always been number one, but Germany was a strong challenger, and France was still there. The United States was coming on strong, and Japan was coming on strong. And who was going to be number one, right? Well, the First World War ended with eliminating Germany, but not entirely. Germany was still very strong. And France and Britain won, but were exhausted. So basically, the First World War did not bring a solution to the problem. Right? And then the United States became stronger, and Japan showed up. So there was a whole number of candidates for the supremacy within the imperialist camp. But we should not forget that Nazi Germany, under Hitler, Germany was still a capitalist country and was still an imperialist country. In fact, you might say that under Hitler, Germany was capitalist and was imperialist, was uber-capitalist and uber-imperialist, and very keen to demolish the Soviet Union and lay its hands on the Soviet Union. Because for Germany, basically the two objectives that I'm dealing with here, doing away with revolution in the shape of Russia, at the same time laying your hands on territories with all kinds of resources, that comes together in the conquest of the Soviet Union. All right? When Hitler marched in 1941 into Russia, I mean, it's not that he wanted it and that the German industry said, oh my God, we get involved in a war, oh my God. No, they wanted it. Because for the German industrialists and bankers, Russia, once the Soviet Union would be destroyed, all of Eastern Europe would become a kind of a big colony for Germany, with the lots of rich agricultural land of the Ukraine, with the oil fields of the Caucasus. All of that would be under German control. And that would have been to Germany what India had been to Britain, a huge colony that we could loot as much as you want and become rich by making them poor. Or it would become also what the Wild West had been to the United States, an immense land to be conquered, to where you could wipe out the local population and then do as you wanted. And that actually, there's some studies that were published recently now, how Hitler was very impressed by the precedents set by the United States when they conquered the Wild West and wiped out the local population. Hitler saw the Slavs the way that the Americans saw the Indians, a people that are in the way. We have to wipe them out. A little genocide, no problem, right? And also as cheap labor. The Slavs were at the same time like the blacks in America, like slaves. So either a people to be wiped out, to disappear from history, or to be used as cheap labor for our benefit. Cheap labor, again, being important, as I just mentioned. So this is how then the Second World War was also a war for imperial supremacy. And it looked as if when Germany, under Hitler's auspices, marched into the Soviet Union in June 1941, and everybody in Berlin, not only in Berlin, but also in London, and also in New York and in Washington, was convinced that war would only last a few months and it would be game over, and Germany would be in control of all of Russia, all the Soviet Union. If that would have happened, Germany would have become the supremo, the number one of international imperialism. No doubt about it. And no country would ever have been able to dislodge the Germans from their position of power. And today, like I wrote in my book, the fashionistas and the Champs-Élysées would walk around in lederhosen and Tiroler hats, German style. And German would be the second language of choice in Europe, not English. So Germany came that close in the Second World War in becoming the number one of the imperialist powers. Right? It didn't because they lost the war in the Soviet Union. It's one of the ironies of history, again. History is full of ironies, that the United States would win the battle for supremacy, thanks to the fact that its biggest competitor, Nazi Germany, was eliminated by the country that it was supposed to have eliminated, and which had the United States and despised the Soviet Union. So actually, after the war, the United States should have been very grateful to the Soviet Union that they eliminated Germany so that the United States could become the number one of imperialism. But they've never shown that gratitude, as you know. In fact, when the war was over, when the Second World War was over, and the struggle for supremacy among imperialist powers was decided in favor of the United States then really continued with the war, the Second World War, in the other phase of the Second World War, a war against the revolution, a war against the Soviet Union. And the Cold War was the logical consequence of that. The Cold War really is the way that you have to settle the unfinished business of the Second World War, which means destroying the country that embodies the revolution. And that was the whole purpose, the whole objective of the Cold War. And that would end in 1989, 1990, as you know, with all the consequences that I describe in one of my books. So that is where or how we can understand both the First and the Second World War as complex historical phenomena that are linked, in that they are both wars against democracy and against revolution. And they are both wars that can be explained in terms of imperialist problems, imperialists looking for territories that have the goodies that they want, and also looking to see who's going to be number one. So that is my view of the two conflicts of the 20th century in Europe.